project plan fairly briefly here. You know, it's interesting to see these things after the fact. This obviously is a waterfall plan. There are ways to do internationalization in an agile setting. As a matter of fact, we even have a whole agile presentation, but I don't think it's necessarily fits with this workshop as well. But sometimes, you know, waterfall is the best way to get an idea of the whole thing. In fact, the reality is that very often, even if a company is an agile shop, if you're internationalizing for the first time, waterfall can be a very, very appropriate methodology that you use. It can sometimes get you done faster because of just how internationalization tends to cut across a product rather than in just, you know, little vertical sections of functionality. But in any case, there are things in common, and you can see, you know, at the beginning we have those project initialization visits and architectural requirement phone calls. Usually by the time this is produced, there's been quite a number of those. So you need those to get this project plan started and the like. So we're assuming that we've done some initial analysis. The static analysis initially has taken place. We've talked about locale. We've met with the client and the like. Do notice though here that we have like work is, for instance, 553 days. A lot of these projects are not trivial. They are, you know, some of them are in the thousands of hours. I have another sample plan that I use that is more scary. It's like 5,000 hours long. You know, it depends on the size and complexity of your project. As I remember, I really took out all the names of everything, and I did this a couple of years ago, but as I remember, I think this was a Java project that was used for peer. It was an online content management for a tool for peer review of scientific information was what the product did. And so sold into educational and association services, as you might imagine, you know, like clients like the Journal of Nature or something like that really are looking at very scientific publications. But so essentially a really big content management app, which is a lot of what everything seems to be these days, content of some sort. Setup may not be as much of an issue for internal work. If you're working with an outside vendor, setup often gets ignored because people take it for granted. But setup, when I say setup, is not just setting up the individual development environment, but developers need a little chance to get familiar with the code. Even if it's a short bit, just to understand the directory structure, to get a little training on that, you know, centrally coordinate that with the team. A little bit of training on the documents that were produced, the project plan approach. You may have the beginning of what an internationalization architectural document. Usually at the front of the project, you don't quite have that. What you have is what we call a findings document, which is not as in detail as an I18, you know, an internationalization architectural document. You do want to build that architectural document as you go, but you don't necessarily need to build this big monolithic document at the very beginning of the process. Then there'll be what we call like research and design. That'll kind of go on during the initial project, like not just up front, but during the whole project. You don't necessarily have to get everything designed up front. You have to get certain critical issues like your locale framework designed up front, but there may be esoteric parts that you can kind of move through. Notice that I've got some color here, and there are colors for issues that involve the client organization, and in this case it's clear with a company like Lingoport who the client is and who the developers are. But for you internally, that probably applies as well if you're doing your own effort. You're going to need things from your development team as far as getting started. Those are in blue. You're going to, on my screen, let's see, the colors really get messed up between here. So there are other things that happen from different stakeholders in different colors. I'm getting all confused on the colors. Let's see, number 13. This is really interesting. So on my screen, this is red, and blues mean entirely different things. So we definitely have some color transposition between the projector and my screen. So for instance, for us, we might invoice here, so that's something going to the client. You're just telling who's doing what at different times. And that's important because, for instance, you'll notice one of the first things we were doing here is delivering a framework for requirements and scope and documentation for the client to approve. Now, they have to, whoever you're working, and you've got to have buy-in the whole time. And this is not unique to internationalization, but what you really want to avoid is you're on the other side of the wall, and they're doing their thing on their side of the wall, and nobody really understands what both parties are doing. So you want to really establish good communication, good documentation up front. I would suggest never just deliver a document, a planning document or an architectural document into somebody's inbox. Deliver that and deliver that with, hey, we're going to have a meeting in 3 days over this, and you need to be prepared, and then even if you're not prepared, I'm going to walk you through it. That's because you don't want to find out a month and a half into the project that they would have rather you did it this way. That's their chance to kind of put a stake in it of their wants and likes and dislikes. What you both might do might be perfectly valid, but you need to give time to accommodate that. And I've just found that inboxes can be a black hole, and that people have the best intentions of reading your email, but they also have the best intentions of reading 40 other emails as well that day. You have an approval process, and you kind of go through how are you dealing with the database, and you'll see through each what we'll call area of the code. So here's the database. You had asked about strings. We are delivering strings for review, so we're delivering those string reports. You see a lot of scanning here and scanning updates in the various database files, and then delivering those. Again, we have the same thing here in the presentation tier. We have delivering what we're doing before we do it, and then moving very quickly into, okay, we got to do it. We update the scans. There's a little bit of back and forth in the scans. That's always there. And then you deliver those strings for review. They say yes, you externalize the strings, and they're ready for translation. So you see that all over. The strings are done really up front. And then you get into the deal of you're constantly kind of revising your project plan, because you want your project plan to reflect reality, not what you thought reality was at the beginning of the project. And this is an interesting fight, because many very strong developers will resist a project plan. Certainly not all, but it's not an uncommon situation that I've seen, that a strong developer will be like, well, the project plan is sort of useless after we get into this. You've got to kind of resist that, because the project plan is how you're going to measure the whole team, not that just one brilliant developer. And the project plan is your budget. You've got to come in on both budget on time, and so You want to be updating your project plan versus letting that drop, and you've got to allow time for that, your entire time. The other thing is you want to build your QA into the process. So generally, what happens with internationalization is the testing is going to be rather large scale, as opposed to adding a feature or an agile release where you have a 3-week sprint and you can just test this one small area. You have either a whole lot of small areas and a whole lot of iterations and a whole bunch of product backlog, or in this case we're doing a waterfall, we have to test across the whole product. And so you're going to need, if you're a separate I18n group of, let's say, 5 engineers, you're going to need a lot of buy-in and coordination with the QA group, because they've probably been testing this product for years, and it's going to be easier to work in cooperation with them than it is for you to reinvent how you test the whole application. Now what you're going to do then is expand what's being tested. US English is now, presuming you're a US company, US English is just another locale. You're testing across the spectrum using pseudo-localization, you're passing data in perhaps from the database and round-tripping it. You're really having to bang on the whole thing. But you need the buy-in from the testing group so that you have good coverage in your tests. So again, we've delivered, at this point I kind of jumped ahead, we've delivered all the planning, you've come up with a QA plan, now you go into construction, you can see we're getting the database out of the way pretty fast, because the database tends to spread across the whole application. You kind of want to get that stuff going pretty quickly. Your presentation tier, you maybe have a couple of people that work on the presentation tier, one person that's working on the database, and you kind of split up your groups that way, working not across the code, but in their sections of code that they're responsible for. And in this case, it looks like we were leaving the developer dashboard in English. Sometimes you'll see, like, as a scoping issue, you might leave the admin portion of an application. So the administration portion should say, oh, it's always a systems IT person that will be using that, and they always work in English, so we're going to leave that out. There's a whole argument there whether that's appropriate or not, but that's a different argument kind of thing. Sometimes in an imperfect world, we just have to get stuff done faster, so we leave parts out of scope. But at least let's make sure that what we're doing isn't going to break how that functionality, how that part of the code works. And you can see, here in the presentation, we're dealing with encoding, making sure that that encoding is done. Fortunately, these are JSP pages. You can see that's not actually a huge task. We only have a few days involved in that. The encoding task was a total of 8 days, pretty good in the world of programming. So on. Then we go into string refactoring. We're externalizing strings. And again, we're delivering these presentation strings so that they can be localized so that we can then reincorporate. Now we have a middle tier here. You can see line 131, we have the middle tier that we're going through. Again, it's the same set of functions. We're going ahead, we're string refactoring, and then we're looking at locale sensitive methods and programming patterns. You see, like if you look at line 138, we're pseudo-localizing so that we're building some test of what we're doing right into our engineering. That's sort of our unit test before we go into the sort of monolithic QA phase. Then we have a merge phase. You can see in phase 1 we have a QA. We have this is a two-phased approach, so there was something that we were doing as a phase 2. It might have been the Unicode enablement. I don't remember what this was. but you can see here time zone and address, phone numbers, and the like. So we phase that within the various presentations, and we have multiple code merge points. So after phase 1, we had a code merge point, and after phase 2. That let us kind of reduce some scope. It does add more testing onus. It does add another code merge phase. But that code merge that we did at the end of phase 1 was done because they were busy adding all kinds of new features, and we wanted to reduce risk as we all brought that out. And instead of this big merge at the end that would now have a huge amount of files that would be merged, we found a place where we could merge within and start the development of the internationalization, where we wouldn't break everything, and so we could get a running application between the new features and the internationalized features, bring them up and deliver. So instead of having, I don't know, 20,000 files that have been changed that you're merging in 5 different projects, you minimize that. So we go through phase 2, and it's much of the same thing. We're delivering the strings. We get the translated strings back, and we start to integrate them back in, and you see the various different phases here of tiers. You even have a phase 3. And at the end, we build in the linguistic testing. Now, generally, when you go into linguistic testing, that's all on the localization side. So when I say linguistic testing, you're making sure that the appropriate words are used in the appropriate context. Many developers don't realize that when translation is done, it's often done like within translation tools on a list basis. So you have the source words and you have the target locale, and you go in and you see those line by line, completely outside of the context of the translation. I should mention that there's some new development that Lingoport will likely bring to market that lets you actually see the translations in the context of the actual web application. So not just on the client side, but it lets you see like a web page and then the string, and then it pulls back all the way to the database or the properties files of where that string is, and you can translate it on the fly and see the application as a user would see. So the idea is it's like a WYSIWYG translation agent for distributed applications. We've for a long time had tools like Pasolo and Catalyst that did a very nice job, but not in a multi-tiered environment, so to speak. So that's something that we're a little premature talking about, but we should have in the very not distant future, like in the next month. So we're working out some of the final details on that. But the point there is, if you're going to go through testing, the problem with a lot of linguistic testing is the reality of it is you're running through all the screens, and rather than being able to change it right there, you're circling an issue and then finding where is that string in the properties file and going back and forth. It's just a really time-consuming process. So the idea is to have a WYSIWYG so you can see it there, click on it, and actually change the translation right there and edit it. But you need to leave time for that. Chances are that during the linguistic testing there will be changes that you need to then create, get the localization back, create the new build, and then incorporate them and the like. So it will take your internationalization group a little time. We have the acceptance testing, everything's accepted. Note that the final design document is never really finished till the end of the project, because you want to reflect what you've learned, not just what you thought you were going to have to do. You have to have built in that you're going to need flexibility. That design document is really useful because because again, you want your development teams not to be in the same problem 2 years from now. We advise our clients, most of them take our advice on running Globalyzer regularly after we're done, make that part of your process so you can track these issues. The other good thing is if we've been doing services, we've built the rule sets, you know, it's kind of all ready, it's like, go. So there's a lot of ease there, but you kind of can't get away from, like, design documents are the roadmap for developers. If they're all familiar with the internationalization design, they can understand why things work the way they do. It's easier for them to avoid the problem in the first place. So that again, we always, like you'll see project management here, we all know that it always ends up taking more time than you ever think. And that's kind of the human factor part of things. Project managers definitely earn their keep. There's a lot of backwards and forwards. I found that on internationalization projects, the pure project manager, and I'm probably going to hurt somebody's feeling, that has the PMP certification but doesn't actually know software development, is at a great deal of disadvantage. You actually, you know, structuring your project, you want more of a senior engineer project lead that maybe works with that project manager who may not be technical, but it's really the project lead that the success of the project will last on. My suggestion for internationalization, it is so time critical, is that, you know, if possible, have your project manager have a good engineering background, or at least be very tightly integrated with your project manager. And your project manager then becomes somebody who's doing things like more like doing the counting of time, the counting of money, the projection based on past performance. But the senior engineer is really, these projects tend to be a little dynamic as you go, and so you want that deep engineering knowledge. It is much more of a guarantee of success. So, any questions? All right. Very good. Well, just you know, as we'll probably clean up our presentation a little bit. There's an agile section that I'll throw on there because I found that people need to give a lot of agile presentations these days. So we have an agile I18n presentation. We'll wrap up the slides for deliverables. We actually won't be wrapping up a PDF of the project plan, just because it you know, I don't know, there's a lot of intellectual know-how that goes into those things, and so we didn't want to make that a deliverable, but we'll certainly give you the slides so that you can, you know, if that helps you in your work with your own organizations, happy to. We're always happy to help with questions. Again, reminder, iMug is Thursday night. Visit lingoport.com. We have lots of articles. We're kind of article and webinar prolific. That is, we produce a lot of webinars, we produce a lot of articles, and we post those recordings online on YouTube or on Vimeo, so that you can see them at any time. We have a pretty regular mailer that goes out, usually with very useful information. Not information like, hey, we have a new website. It's more like information you can use in your work. But thanks for spending the morning with us, with Olivia and I. We're here all week, so good for questions. Thank you.